Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we are finally going to be talking about the newest album from Portugal the Man, called Woodstock. This is awkward. Mostly because if you had told me a few months ago that I was going to be putting together this particular review under these particular circumstances, I probably would have called you crazy, and yet... Okay, let me back up here. A couple of months ago, I was actually contacted by Portugal the Man and their management to produce a video where I could give a review for one of their upcoming singles for their new album, Woodstock, that they would use in a tongue-in-cheek sort of way in some of their promotional material. Now, I know a bunch of critics that I like and respect who contributed to this, but I didn't for three main reasons. Number one, it felt perilously close to something that might potentially compromise my critical ethics, and I prefer to be safe rather than sorry in that regards. Not blaming anybody who did it, just wasn't for me. Number two, if I had done that video, I would have felt obliged to cover the record at length, and I prefer to use my schedule editions for albums that I have a vested interest in actually reviewing. And finally, number three, it's a Portugal the Man record. Who the hell was gonna care? Yeah, I know that. In retrospect, now it feels a little bit dismissive, but Portugal the Man has never been an indie rock act that I've ever really had much interest in. They've never really been a huge critical darling as they flirted with electronic and psychedelic textures, and I personally am not a huge fan of frontman John Gourley's vocals or his songwriting, but I wouldn't begrudge anybody at being a fan of this group. They're not bad per se. They were fine enough, I guess, but I never found them all that interesting enough to pursue more, especially once they signed to Atlantic and brought on Brian Burton behind the production boards. And if you've seen any of my reviews talking about Burton's production over the past 2 to 3 years, you would understand exactly where I'm coming from here. And then feel it still topped the rock charts, and suddenly, over a decade into their career, Portugal the Man actually had a bona fide hit. It's a weird feeling seeing that and realizing that you could have been part of their whole promotional effort, but now I at least understand why so many people want me to cover this album and voted it up the schedule. So, okay, let's give them what they want. What did we find on Woodstock? Honestly, I got pretty much exactly what I expected. A pretty serviceable enough indie record from Portugal the Man that has many of the mixed strengths and frustrations that I've seen across a lot of their work already, with maybe a few songs that took tentative steps towards the mainstream and a little bit more accessibility, but much more that would easily fit into what you would expect from a lot of their sound. Now granted, I say this without deep intimacy with every single one of their albums. I did my re-listen through their entire discography to be sure, and honestly their material just started running together for me. And I have heard from some of their die-hard fans that this does reflect a more notable shift outside of the more interesting, psychedelic, messier textures that colored earlier albums. But truth be told, maybe a step outside of that could be good for the band, especially going forward if they're going to continue in this particular direction. Now I should explain with this, and the most appropriate place is with a lot of the production, the composition, and the instrumentation. And here's the thing, in re-listening to Portugal the Man's entire back catalog, I did get hints of a spacier, weirder side that, yeah, was pretty agreeable, but always stood out for me the most is how the band was able to marry a lot of those tones to sharper grooves and hooks. Less flaming lips and more temples, for example. Except where the latter band opted for a more retro-leaning pickup, a little bit more of a vintage sound, Portugal the Man opted for a much cleaner tones and relied on weird guitar filters, synths, and some electronic layers in order to intensify that psychedelia. And yet, going to Woodstock, which apparently is aiming for a bit more of a radio-friendly, mainstream approach, I can't help but see that as more of a blessing for the group, because when they pull back towards some of the psychedelic side on this album, it nearly always misfires. The ugly, cluttered synth and the guitar layers on Easy Tiger, the flimsy 4 bars of washed out guitar solo on So Young, they really could have expanded that, the guitar interludes and oily synth wells on Mr. Lonely, the claustrophobic watery layers against a painfully thin fake percussion line on Noise Pollution, that groove it just tries to punch through and never quite gets there. There are elements of weirdness that just kind of feel tacked on. And sure, the liquid guitars behind so much of So Young might feel a bit like a languid Chili Peppers reject and keep on as a mid to late 90s choppy strum that can't help but clash a little bit awkwardly against some of those vocal samples that are tacked on that are a little bit more modern, but they are indicative of a focus on melodic groove, which I do like, which is where the record actually has some real strength to it. In retrospect, it's no surprise feel it still has done so well with the retro soul foundation in the bass. And that's a similar formula that works even better on the sharper edges of Live in the Moment, or the noisy chop of the riff of Rich Friends, even if that melody on the hook does kind of remind me a bit of the Bee Gees theme song for Grease. Granted, on the flip side, with the stiff, blocky reggae of Tidal Wave, which sticks out like a sore thumb on the album, which from the composition to every weedy layer, it screams like a song intended for crossover appeal. I would not be surprised if this eventually becomes a single. Now, granted, some of this could have been alleviated by the vocal line, and look, I've gone on the record in this very review saying I'm not crazy about John Gourley's vocals, but the truth is that I'm more underwhelmed by them, and I'm not convinced that he leverages his otherwise decent falsetto as well as he could. Sure, I personally like his lower range on songs like Live in the Moment, which tends to complement the more languid grooves and that tone a little bit more effectively, but with the right multi-tracking and backing support, that falsetto, it's got enough clarity in the tone to click for me, but that would imply the multi-tracking and vocal production was remotely consistent across the album, which it is not. The most egregious example is on Mr. Lonely, which pulls in Fat Lip from the Far Side for a tacked-on outro verse, but why this song features pitched down verses from Zoe Manville before tacking on auto-tune for Gourley's vocals at points only serves to highlight synthetic edges to the production that are just kind of distracting, which later crops up again on Noise Pollution and only serve to take away from some strong underlying grooves. Now, normally I'd be inclined to point at Brian Burton, as his fingerprints are all over some of the oilier tones on Mr. Lonely and Number 1, but the truth is that of all the producers that Portugal the Man brought in, I wouldn't say that any one of them gives the band any sort of real guitar edge or accentuate the grooves enough, or at least choosing synth tones that could blend effectively and not stick out in gummy splotches, especially considering some of the percussion covering up otherwise some really solid melodic grooves and hooks at the roots of most of these songs. Hell, when the production gets out of its own damn way, you get some pretty decent tunes. But then we're stuck going to the lyrics and themes to figure out what these songs are actually about. And can I say that right out of the gate, for as much as Portugal the Man they want to call back to an earlier era in rock music, there is something that feels a little bit mercenary as they strip mine older tones or melodies or even samples to recreate a Woodstock '69 feeling of revolution. And it starts out pretty early with Number 1, where you have a sample from the late Richie Havens' Freedom that was speaking to a much more soulful feeling of anxiety and depression at that time, and then Portugal the Man used it to set up their rubbery, warping song about how they're being forced to recycle old ideas to seem relevant. I mean, the song sets up the cynical layer of nihilism that seeps through so much of the lyrics on this album, how so much of culture and human interaction is just disposable, and they're just cribbing whatever they can along the way, which seemed to be the attitude when it comes to writing some of the lyrics specifically here, where on songs like Easy Tiger and Rich Friends, Gourley admits in some of the annotations that I checked on Genius that he knows these lyrics are stupid, but he just used them anyway because who cares? Why bother? And yet, when you juxtapose that flippant attitude with songs that require a little bit more sincerity, like the introspection of Mr. Lonely, or the attempts at political statements like on Noise Pollution, it kind of undercuts the message. It feels a little bit too broadly sketched, not quite getting that nuance, or even more so like hopping on a protest bandwagon, even cribbing from an older era to do so because they don't have the conviction to get there on their own. To quote Feel It Still, they're rebels just for kicks. And even if they do feel something, there isn't quite that deeper conviction to usher it back themselves. Now, even with all that being said, there are points where this sort of attitude can kind of work. Both So Young and Live in the Moment, they rely on a veneer of control masking something more desperate and more earnest beneath it. But on the flip side, you got the cynicism hitting a peak on Rich Friends, leeching off of people who are more popular and wealthy, almost swiveling into pitch-black melodrama going so over the top in some of the lines. And yet, even still, maybe it's a factor of Gourley's delivery or some of the production that's screaming for some real bite and edge to these songs, but something can't help but feel kind of calculated. And it's that sort of calculation that just rubs the more punk side of me just the wrong way. But as a whole, look, I was pretty hard on this project, I can admit that, but it's more because there actually is a core to this album that could have been executed better, could have been refined a little bit more, or gotten a little bit rougher or messier, even speaking from outside of the Portugal the Man's previous albums. Yeah, there are duds here, and I personally find the cynicism and detached calculation towards social change kind of an exasperating attitude, especially right now, but again, that's my own personal issue. But there are also a few really solid tunes, and a core of grooves that makes this record pretty passable in my books. There are decent singles here, netting a very light 6 out of 10 and a very cautious recommendation. If you're looking to pick this up having heard Feel It Still, you'll probably enjoy a few other songs here, if not the project as a whole, which is pretty much my attitude to it. Otherwise, at this point in their careers, I have no clue if Portugal the Man are going to double down on a more refined or tight sound, or continue to split the difference to middling results. So if you're curious, it's got its merits, but otherwise, I wouldn't say you're missing all that much. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. Like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I'm kind of amazed I had this much to say about Portugal the Man, but hey, if you want to buy the album, links in the description below, and I got the poll up there. By now, majority of you have probably heard this, so I'm curious where you fell on it, especially Portugal the Man fans who might be more familiar with their overall discography. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my schedule so I'm not covering this 2 months after it got released, link to my Patreon is right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week you guys in the higher tiers get to add albums or even movies to that schedule. More details right there, but till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.